Los Angeles, August 8, 1969. It was late when four people climbed toward a secluded house above Benedict Canyon. The property at 10,050 Cielo Drive belonged to another world. Movie stars, record producers, swimming pools, and the illusion that the violence consuming the rest of America could not reach this far into the hills. Inside were actress Sharon Tate, 8 months pregnant, celebrity hairstylist Jay Sebring, coffee heiress Abigail Folger, and writer Wojciech Frykowski. A teenage visitor named Stephen Parent was leaving the property. Before sunrise, all five were dead. The killers had not arrived to rob the house. They barely knew the people inside. They had been sent. The man who gave the order never entered the house that night. His name was Charles Manson. He had spent most of his life being controlled by institutions. Now, for the first time, he had built an institution of his own. And inside it, obedience had become more important than conscience. Charles Mills Manson was born in Cincinnati in 1934. His early life was unstable, and by adolescence he was moving through reform schools, detention facilities, and prisons. Theft, escape attempts, car theft, forgery, and other crimes repeatedly returned him to custody. By the time he reached his 30s, institutional life was more familiar to him than freedom. When Manson was released from federal prison in March 1967, the United States outside the gates had changed. San Francisco had become the center of a youth counterculture built around music, communal living, psychedelic drugs, and rejection of conventional authority. Thousands of young people arrived searching for identity, belonging, and a different way to live. Manson arrived searching for something too. He was 32 years old, older than most of the people drifting through Haight-Ashbury. He could play guitar. He could talk for hours. He borrowed pieces of religion, psychology, prison survival, popular music, and the language of the counterculture. He did not need to invent every idea. He only needed to convince vulnerable people that he understood them better than everyone they had left behind. One of Manson's earliest followers was Mary Brunner, a young librarian he met in California. Others followed. Many were young women who had separated from families, schools, or conventional lives. To outsiders, they looked like part of the same social movement filling the streets of San Francisco. Inside the group, something different was forming. Manson presented himself less as a leader than as a guide who could strip away fear, ego, jealousy, and the false identities imposed by society. He spoke about living without possessions. He challenged ordinary ideas of family and sexual relationships. He encouraged followers to see their previous lives as barriers to enlightenment. The group traveled together, picking up new members. Their identities began to merge into a collective one. They called themselves a family. But this family did not distribute authority equally. Over time, Manson decided where they stayed, where people slept, what they wore when they ate, and when the entire group moved. The language was freedom. The structure was control. That contradiction was easy to miss from inside the group. Manson rarely needed to introduce himself as an authoritarian. He could frame obedience as proof that a follower had finally escaped the rules of ordinary society. If parents objected, parents were trapped by ego. If old friends expressed concern, they were incapable of understanding. If a member felt uncomfortable, the discomfort itself could be treated as evidence that there was still more ego to destroy. The result was a system that made outside criticism useful to Manson. Every warning could become another reason to stay. The language was freedom. The structure was control. Manson wanted more than spiritual authority. He wanted to become a musician. In 1968, members of the family crossed paths with Dennis Wilson, drummer for the Beach Boys. The connection brought Manson into a world he had spent years watching from outside. For a time, members of the family lived around Wilson's home. Manson performed his songs and met people connected to the Los Angeles music industry, including producer Terry Melcher. Melcher had lived at 10,050 Cielo Drive before Sharon Tate and Roman Polanski moved there. For Manson, these relationships appeared to offer a path toward legitimacy, money, and fame. He recorded demos. He performed for people who could have opened doors. The door stayed closed. The Beach Boys eventually recorded a reworked version of one of Manson's songs, but the recording career he imagined never materialized. The rejection mattered because Manson had already presented himself to his followers as someone whose importance the outside world would eventually recognize. Hollywood had allowed him close enough to see the life he wanted. Then it reminded him that he did not belong there. The music connection also gave Manson something more useful than a possible record deal. It gave him status inside the family. Dennis Wilson was famous. Terry Melcher had access to the record industry. Expensive houses, musicians, cars, and studios seemed to confirm what Manson had been telling his followers, that powerful people recognized something important in him. When those relationships failed to produce the career he expected, the same world could be redefined as corrupt, cowardly, or blind. Manson's personal failure became another grievance against the society he was teaching the family to reject. The group eventually settled at Spahn Ranch, an aging former movie location in the hills outside Los Angeles. From a distance, it could look like another communal experiment. The court record describes something far more structured. Manson's authority extended into ordinary life. Followers were expected to surrender possessions and obey him. He decided where members slept and how the group organized itself. Women were used to attract new recruits and maintain relationships useful to the family. Security around the ranch grew increasingly elaborate. Guards were posted. Walkie-talkies linked different areas. Dark clothing and camouflage were used at night. The outside world became something to distrust. Inside, Manson spoke for hours. Followers listened. Psychedelic drugs were common in the group's environment, but the power of the system did not depend on LSD alone. Isolation, repetition, exhaustion, sex, fear of abandonment, and constant reinforcement all made the family more dependent on itself, and therefore more dependent on Manson. The crucial transformation was not that every follower stopped thinking. It was that disagreement became dangerous to belonging. Manson did not need a supernatural ability to control minds. He needed a group in which obedience felt safer than leaving. Spahn Ranch helped make that possible. The court record describes a community of roughly 20 people living apart from conventional society. They occupied bunkhouses and campsites and survived through a patchwork of favors, scavenging, petty crime, and relationships with outsiders. George Spahn, the elderly owner of the ranch, allowed them to stay in exchange for work. The setting was physically isolated, but still close enough to Los Angeles for Manson to maintain contacts, acquire supplies, and pursue his ambitions. This combination mattered. The family could feel separated from society without being completely cut off from it. Manson controlled when that boundary opened and when it closed. Manson repeatedly attacked the idea of a stable individual identity. The self he taught was ego. Family ties were attachments. Conventional morality belonged to a corrupt society. Within that logic, surrender could be presented as liberation. This is where the phrase brainwashing becomes too simple. There was no single technique and no switch that turned independent people into killers. Instead, the family created a closed social system. Manson controlled access to approval. He defined what experiences meant. He could turn humiliation into a lesson, fear into proof of spiritual weakness, and obedience into evidence that a follower was evolving. The group also provided powerful rewards: intimacy, purpose, attention, sexual access, community, and the feeling of possessing secret knowledge unavailable to ordinary people. Leaving meant losing all of it. Some followers also changed names, appearances, relationships, and personal habits inside the group. The more of an old identity that disappeared, the more psychologically expensive it became to recover it. This did not make every person equally loyal. Members came and went. Some resisted. Some later described fear, confusion, or disagreement. But the inner circle that remained had spent months living inside a reality in which Manson's interpretations were repeated every day and reinforced by the people around them. By 1969, some members treated Manson's authority as nearly absolute. Court testimony described followers who regarded him as infallible, even godlike. That belief would become lethal when Manson's private mythology began demanding enemies. In late 1968, the Beatles released the White Album. Manson became obsessed with it. He told followers that the songs contained messages meant for him and that America was approaching an apocalyptic race war. He called this coming conflict Helter Skelter. According to testimony later presented in court, Manson predicted that Black Americans would rise against white society, destroy the existing order, and then prove unable to govern what remained. The family, he said, would hide during the chaos. Afterward, they would emerge and take control. The fantasy was racist, paranoid, and internally contradictory. But within a closed group, contradiction was not necessarily a weakness. Manson could reinterpret failed predictions as signs that the group had misunderstood the timing, or that action was now required. This point remains important. The prosecution later made Helter Skelter central to its explanation of motive. Witness testimony supported that Manson repeatedly preached the idea. Historians have continued debating whether it explains every decision that led to the murders. What is clear is that by the summer of 1969, Manson was no longer talking only about surviving violence. The language also gave the family a way to divide the world. Insiders possessed hidden knowledge. Outsiders were asleep. The wealthy white establishment became pigs. Black Americans were reduced inside Manson's racist fantasy to actors in a war he imagined he could manipulate. And because Manson claimed the coming catastrophe was inevitable, ordinary moral limits could be reframed as temporary rules belonging to a world that was about to disappear. He was discussing how violence might begin. Before Cielo Drive, the family had already crossed into murder. In July 1969, musician Gary Hinman was held at his home by members of the group. Manson arrived during the confrontation and slashed Hinman's face with a sword. After Manson left, Bobby Bosalil killed Hinman. Manson was later convicted for his role in that murder. The killing matters because it destroys the idea that the Tate murders appeared suddenly from nowhere. The family had already demonstrated that confinement, assault, and murder could be carried out inside Manson's system of authority. Another man connected to the ranch, Donald Shorty, would also be murdered later in 1969. Manson was eventually convicted in that case as well. By August, violence was no longer theoretical, and Manson's predictions were failing. The racial war he had described had not begun. According to the prosecution's case, Manson decided that the family would have to help start it. There were also practical pressures around the group. Manson's music career had failed. Police attention around Spahn Ranch was increasing. Members were committing crimes to keep the commune functioning. The family's mythology was promising a transformation that never arrived. A belief system built around prophecy faces a problem when reality refuses to cooperate. The leader can admit he was wrong, or he can demand that his followers make the prophecy true. On the evening of August 8, 1969, Manson told Linda Kasabian to go with Charles Tex, Watson, and do what Watson told her. Susan Atkins and Patricia Krenwinkel joined them. Watson drove to 10,050 Cielo Drive. The house still carried an important connection to Manson's failed ambitions. Terry Melcher had once lived there. but the people inside that night had no meaningful relationship with Manson's family. Stephen Parent encountered the group as he was leaving and was killed near the gate. Inside the property, Watson, Atkins, and Krenwinkel attacked Sharon Tate, Jay Sebring, Abigail Folger, and Wojciech Frykowski. Kasabian remained outside for much of the violence and later became the prosecution's key witness. By morning, 5 people were dead. Los Angeles initially had no reason to connect the victims to an obscure commune at an old movie ranch. That distance between the killers and the victims was part of what made the crime difficult to understand. There was no clear robbery motive. No personal dispute tied all 5 victims to the attackers. Sharon Tate and her guests were famous enough to attract enormous attention, but fame did not explain why they had been selected. The killings were deliberately chaotic and horrifying, but the most revealing moment came afterward. The group returned to Spahn Ranch. Manson was waiting. According to testimony, he asked whether they felt remorse. They said no. Then he told them not to discuss what had happened. The first night had proven that his followers would kill strangers on command. Manson was not satisfied. According to Linda Kasabian's testimony, he said the first killings had been too messy. The following night, he went out with members of the family himself. For hours they drove through Los Angeles, while Manson considered possible targets. Eventually they stopped near the home of Leno and Rosemary LaBianca. This time Manson entered first. He later returned to the car and told Tex Watson, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten that he had tied up a man and a woman. He gave instructions and left. Leno and Rosemary LaBianca were murdered inside their home. Messages were written at the scene, including the words Helter Skelter. The violence was meant to communicate something larger than the deaths themselves. But instead of creating the future Manson imagined, the murders began destroying the family. Investigators initially struggled to connect the crime scenes. Then arrests, testimony, confessions, and physical evidence slowly brought the separate pieces together. The closed world at Spahn Ranch could not remain closed forever. Yet the investigation did not immediately solve the case. Police initially treated the Tate and LaBianca scenes as separate crimes. Meanwhile, members of the family were being arrested for unrelated offenses. A major break came when Susan Atkins, already in custody in connection with the Gary Hinman case, spoke about the murders to other inmates. The information helped direct investigators toward the family. By December 1969, Manson and several followers had been indicted. The apocalypse he predicted had not arrived. Instead, the outside world was finally entering his. The trial began in 1970 and became a spectacle. Manson had not personally killed the 5 victims at Cielo Drive. He had not remained inside the LaBianca home for those murders either. That became the central paradox of the case. How do you prove that the man who was absent from the killing was responsible for it? The prosecution answered by reconstructing the system around him. Witnesses described his authority over the family, his repeated Helter Skelter teachings, his instructions before the murders, and the behavior of followers who treated his commands as absolute. Linda Kasabian's testimony directly connected Manson's orders to the nights of violence. She received immunity in exchange for testifying fully about what she had witnessed, a fact the defense used aggressively to attack her credibility. The prosecution did not ask the jury to believe that Manson had somehow hypnotized everyone around him. It argued conspiracy. If Manson organized the group, supplied the ideology, issued instructions, and sent followers to carry out killings as part of a shared criminal plan, his physical absence from the first house did not remove responsibility. The spectacle surrounding the trial often threatened to overwhelm that legal question. Manson carved an X into his forehead. Followers outside the courthouse imitated him. Defendants disrupted proceedings. Cameras turned the case into national theater. But beneath the theater was a simpler proposition. Orders can have consequences, even when the person giving them stays behind. Manson, Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten were convicted in the Tate-LaBianca case. Tex Watson was convicted separately. Manson was originally sentenced to death. California's death penalty was temporarily invalidated in 1972, and his sentence became life imprisonment. He would never leave prison. Charles Manson died in 2017 at the age of 83. But his cultural image survived. Over decades, books, films, interviews, music, photographs, and sensational retellings transformed him into something he had always wanted to become: famous. That mythology can hide the most important part of the story. Manson was not powerful because he possessed supernatural control over other human beings. He built power slowly. He found people searching for identity. He isolated them. He made himself the interpreter of their world. He rewarded surrender. He turned doubt into betrayal and obedience into belonging. Then, when he asked for violence, some of them were ready to provide it. The man who was not inside the house had already done his work long before the killers arrived.